I will work day in and day out.
Wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Daniel Smith-Christopher, Professor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University and author of Keir Hardie, The Bible and Christian Socialism. Welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
Thank you for your invitation. I appreciate it.
It's wonderful to have you on. Now, the first question I wanted to ask is, what made you want to write this particular book?
Well, I was preparing for a course that I taught in London. Our university has a study abroad program based in London, and we're supposed to come up with courses that relate to the British situation and context. And since I do biblical studies, I thought, well, I have interest in progressive politics. My background is Quaker. And so I thought, well, I'll come up with a course that talks about the use of the Bible in 4 moments of progressive British movements. And so I started with the English Civil War, which I knew a bit because that's the birth time of Quakerism. Then Chartism, which I really enjoyed reading about and learning about. And of course, the Bible played a significant role for many of the Chartist activists. And then I'll skip to the 4th one, which is the modern period. But the period I knew the least about, but thought I should include, is the beginnings of the Labour Party. And it was then that I very soon stumbled on to Keir Hardie, of course, as a central character. But what amazed me was how much Keir Hardie was citing and debating Scripture. I mean, he wasn't just dressing up his political rhetoric with, a few references here and there. I mean, you read the pamphlet I started with is "Can a Man Be a Christian on a Pound a Week?" Right? One of his famous early essays. Well, he's debating Scripture left and right in that essay. And I realized, well, okay, this is really very interesting. And the more I read, the more I started going to archives in London and paging through old copies of his newspaper, The Labour Leader, the more amazed I was. I mean, Keir Hardie was very serious about this, and decided, well, I need to share my excitement about this. So that's what led to the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the things that you discuss in the book and is central really to the book is the concept of Christian socialism. Could you explain to the listeners what Christian socialism is versus what they may traditionally think of as socialism? How is it similar? How does it differ? That kind of thing.
Right. Well, we're familiar with the famous line from one of the secretaries of the Labour Party, which is that British socialism owes more to Methodism than Marx.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's been all kinds of interesting critique of that quote, but it is a lovely alliterative quote. So, and there is, of course, a profound truth behind that, which is that the tradition of English radicalism was heavily informed by people who cited Scripture as a major source of encouragement for what they were doing, treating workers with dignity. They saw that as straight out of Scriptures and the Sermon on the Mount. And that is a very important tradition, which is a contrast to the tradition we tend to know more about, which is the Marxist tradition of more severe questioning of the role of religion. And, I'm the first one to admit that the history of Christianity is filled with examples that are not so encouraging when it comes to social movements. But this whole tradition of Christian socialism is a profoundly important tradition. It's less known in the United States. It's more acknowledged as a reality for British historians. But I find it a profoundly inspiring literature. because these folks, these men and women, were quite serious about this. And as I said, I'm used to particularly American politicians who, will make a off the cuff remark to sound vaguely pious.
Yeah.
But not actually engage scripture. I mean, there's serious questions for all his talk about the Bible. There's serious questions that Mr. Trump even knows any scripture. But there's no doubt that the Christian Socialists did know their scripture, and they knew it very well and could argue finer. I mean, Keir Hardie was virtually entirely self-taught, right? He enters the mines at age 10, some say 9, and yet comes to a point where he's debating with clergy in the pages of his newspaper, the Labor Leader. He's all around a very impressive fellow, and there's plenty of others that I found as impressive as well. And I talk about some of them in the book as well to try to provide a context to say, well, yes, it's true. There were others who were talking like this as well, and deserving of attention in their own right.
Yes. What do you think it was about Christianity that seemed to compel Hardie, and for him seem as completely and utterly compatible with his other progressive beliefs? Can you explain how he became a Christian in the sense of being very much an active person who understood the Bible, who was able to, as you say, debate members of the clergy, rather than somebody who was just, a Christian in passing, as such, someone who, may have been baptized but not had a particularly strong or motivating belief system.
Right. I think Hardie, as did many others, recognized in, for example, the teaching example of Jesus, a very powerful guide, ethical guide. I mean, here Jesus is talking about good news for the poor, and to provide a sight for the blind and liberation for the imprisoned. I mean, the fact that he's hanging out with what for his day were the disreputable, and challenging the powers that be. That, by the way, was very important. Was when people would question him, how dare you question this important clergy person, or this, Hardie would fire right back. Matthew 23. Here's Jesus challenging the leaders of his day. I'm not doing any different. In fact, I'm probably a little less harsh than he was. And so I think it's just a matter of trying to take seriously the very powerful ethical guide, which has always been a part of the Christian tradition. It tends to get overlooked in those Christian traditions that emphasize only the sort of what I sometimes call Jesus as Santa Claus. In other words, what we get out of it, right? Yeah. Instead of the idea that Christianity is supposed to provide some sort of ethical guide, some sense of how we want society and the world to be. And that starts already, of course, with the Mosaic tradition. Unfortunately, most Christians are only familiar with the Ten Commandments. Happens to be a big issue right now in the United States. But they're not familiar with the fact that that same Mosaic law outside of the Ten Commandments has profound concern for the hungry, has profound concern for widows and orphans, has profound concern for foreigners. Workers are to be paid every day at sunset. It's just a matter of reading it, and that's what's so kind of amazing about this, is there's an awful lot of lip service to Christianity, but it's a little frustrating if folks aren't even going to bother to read the basic books. Yeah.
Which parts of the Bible do you think, from having read Hardie's work, did he draw the most inspiration from? I know there are certain parts of the book where you mentioned that he seemed particularly to associate himself with parts of the New Testament, but it was simply the New Testament, the Old Testament. Which parts of the Bible do you think Hardie most drew upon in his writing?
While he occasionally would draw from the prophets,
Mhm.
as have numbers of social reformers over the centuries, it's an excellent source for that, of course. It has to be said that he was primarily focused on the New Testament. And I chose to feature in my work some of the passages that he seemed to go to the most, if you could say that these were favorite passages, perhaps. Some of these are not unusual to him, but he also embraced them. The line from the Lord's Prayer, uh, God's will on earth as it is in heaven, to which Hardie would sometimes follow up with, and I doubt there are very many unemployed in heaven. And I mean, there's just these wonderful lines that are just sort of classic Hardieisms. And and on contemplation, even brief consideration, that's a very powerful statement. May things be as well and as ethical and as moral in this place as they are intended to be in the ideals presented to us in the scriptures. That's a powerful thought. He also, I made reference to Matthew 23. He frequently cited Jesus' attack on the Jewish authorities of the day as justification for attacking what he considered to be clergy that weren't behaving or teaching, mostly teaching what he thought they should be teaching. And he wondered why people who were passed off as major religious leaders of the day weren't part of the movement for the alleviation of the working class. And it's a pretty obvious question. And Hardie was demonstrably upset about this. And I was particularly impressed with, there's a passage in Paul in 2 Thessalonians. The passage famously says, the ones who don't work will not eat. This is typically used as a sort of conservative trope to bash on the poor, saying they're lazy, right? Get a job. And Hardie did not read that passage that way at all. He thought it referred to the idle rich who aren't doing anything for their income, right? So therefore, why should they have the privilege of eating?
No.
And here's the interesting thing about that fascinating Hardie argument. I'm able to document that in contemporary debate about that passage, we're coming round to a form of Hardie's argument. That it turns out that Paul is most likely attacking the patronage system of ancient Rome, where people would try to attach themselves to the elite in order to gain the benefits of aligning themselves with a powerful person, both the financial benefits and the social benefits. And Paul is condemning this. And that's much closer to Hardie's argument than it has been the classical common use of that as some kind of a bat to hit the poorer classes with. And so there are times when I think that Hardie was just downright prophetic, that he had the ability to do some serious thinking about these passages in the context of his social concerns. And in my opinion, in a very impressive way.
Absolutely. One of the things that I find interesting about the book as well, and you touched upon it a bit earlier, are the other great leaders of the Labour Party who also were part of that kind of Christian socialist tradition. You have Philip Snowden, who of course was a great temperist and involved in the temperance movement as well. Right. Ramsay MacDonald, learning his socialism from the Christian Socialists, John Bruce Glazier, etc. How do you think they differed at all? Did they differ at all to Hardie? And how similar were they in terms of their interpretations of Christianity and how much they saw it as relevant to their politics?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think that they would probably have instantly agreed that their Christian faith is significant. What I found interesting, however, is in my working through the 2 volumes of Snowden's autobiography, I found like 2 scriptural quotes. And in his little pamphlet, Can a Man Be a Christian on a Pound a Week? There's something like 25 scripture references just in a little pamphlet. So I would say, whereas they're all serious about Christian socialism, and there's no doubt that certain kinds of progressive Christian values influence them, they're not debating the text of scripture like Hardie was. And I found that absolutely fascinating, and which is one of the reasons, as someone who does scripture studies, that I was so attracted to Hardie as a case, because he clearly relished this. And when he took on clergy, he would cite a number of passages, and then he would close out his editorial with, and if you want to come back for more, I got a bunch more for you. I mean, it's just this wonderful tone that he took that was just, frankly, still, after all these decades, it's still entertaining to read. So I would say that's the major difference, is that Hardie seemed more interested in many of the, I'm not sure I could write a book like this, for example, about Snowden. I don't think I could write it on MacDonald. The simple fact is there just aren't enough sources where they discuss scripture at length so that you could write a book like this. With Hardie, goodness sakes, it's everywhere.
I think then that perhaps demonstrates the kind of like shift that happened in the Labour Party after Hardie's death, because certainly something that you will see when you look at any history of the Labour Party is that as time goes on, it's not a party that sees, in comparison to when it was founded, Christian socialism as much of a motivating factor as it was towards the start of the Labour Party. Do you think that the kind of firebrandiness of Hardie and the willingness to be engaged in scripture and to use it not just in a lip servicey way was perhaps lost as those who took over from Hardie led Labour into government, the McDonalds, the Snowdens, who certainly had it in the background of their kind of like intellectual ideas, but perhaps didn't have it in the foreground as much as Hardie did.
Well, I think that's certainly true. I mean, I can think of examples that come close. I mean, Tony Benn was quite aware of Christian socialist history. I mean, he would often participate in going to honor the levelers. And there in the Cotswolds, it's Burford, I think, is the famous location. I was just there a few months ago and saw the wonderful plaque in the honor of the levelers. I'm aware that he was interested. Tony Blair was interested in Christian socialism generally, but I haven't read much that would suggest he was interested in debating particular passages. So I would say, I think the tradition is here and there. If Arthur Scargill loved scripture, I'd sure love to know about it, and would be delighted to hear speeches or sermons where it's cited. I mean, this gets into another related area, which is that one of the things I was absolutely fascinated with. You go to the People's Museum in Manchester, for example, and you see their wonderful collection of Union banners, and frequently there will be a scene from the Bible that's part of these banners, right? The bricklayers would have pictures of Solomon's temple, and things like this. I mean, it's wonderful stuff. So the tradition is certainly there and can be traced to particular individuals, but I'm not as aware in the content. Now, if I lived in Britain and had more access to detailed knowledge of labor activists throughout the country, I might find a few. I'd be delighted if this book brings some out of the woodwork, so that dialogue can continue.
I mean, hopefully that will be the case, and certainly I would be encouraging people who are listening, who are interested, to go out and do some research of their own.
Yeah,
In terms of pacifism and Christianity, I'm thinking towards the end of Hardie's life, and obviously
yeah,
the First World War, and there is that divide in the Labour Party, isn't there? During the First World War between those who believe that they can't be involved in supporting the war, and those who often stand against it, quite often for
right.
pacifist Christian socialist beliefs.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is a moment that we can look at perhaps what we've just been talking about, the kind of like divergence in some way of the traditions within the Labour Party? And what did you find in terms of Hardie's writing towards the end of his life
Yeah.
about his Christian beliefs, and how perhaps they related to the war?
There was a comment, I don't know if it was in Morgan's biography, but there was a comment that suggests that some believe that Hardie died of a broken heart over World War I. He was passionately committed to a certain kind of labor pacifism, right? This now as a Quaker, I'm familiar with the sort of standard Christian arguments in defense of pacifism. Like my Mennonite brothers and sisters, right? They go straight to the Sermon on the Mount and they talk about love your enemies and things like that. Quakers tend to talk about the spirit of unity and humanity, and they might get around to quoting Jesus. and, but labor pacifism was a different animal for me, right? This argument, the famous argument that war is workers killing workers, and that there ought to be more of a sense of a unified sense of our comrades who are struggling there as we are struggling here, and shouldn't we see some kind of unity in this? That kind of thinking was also very much a part of Hardie's nonviolence, and it's important to acknowledge that because it is not a common argument used in contemporary Christian defenses of pacifism. But I think it's a powerful one, and I think it's an interesting one. But it's just one that especially the peace churches, Quakers, Mennonites, Brethren, and a few others, they tend not to use that argument. Right? They want to go to New Testament sources for obvious reasons to defend nonviolence. But Hardie was more diverse than that, and more of a product of his context in terms of the labor movement. So I found that absolutely fascinating. And yet another reason why I thought paying attention to a figure like Hardie raised all kinds of interesting questions that, quite frankly, I'm not sure I would have encountered in other more typical contexts where these issues get debated, particularly among Christian theologians.
Absolutely. What do you think in terms of you've obviously referenced politics in America, and the relationship between religion and politics in America is well known. What do you think politicians perhaps in America, politicians now in the United Kingdom could learn from this book and from Hardie's writings about Christianity, about ways to engage in faith and kind of engage in some of the arguments that exist in the Bible?
Well, one of the things that I hope happens is just a sense of encouragement for Christians who are on the left and feel themselves to be supporters of progressive building of the human enterprise. I hope it's encouraging to learn that there were profound voices in our history, both in the US and in the UK, as well as elsewhere. By the way, I'm working on a project dealing with Christian socialism in a variety of contexts around the world. That's kind of an exciting project. But I'm hoping that folks will find some encouragement from this and realize, oh, gosh, there were some important voices that I can turn to and have some sense of confidence, a sense of ancestry, right? A sense that I'm standing on the shoulders of powerful men and women, who spoke in these terms, and therefore I should be encouraged to continue the path that I'm working on. You know, Christian progressives can feel lonely, and sometimes it's important to look to the historical contexts to feel some encouragement for that. And secondly, if there are Christians in progressive politics who are hesitant about being a little more forthright about some of their own reasons for doing what they're doing, I hope they can be encouraged as well. Now, of course, I'm well aware that some of them know as much about Hardie as I do. And maybe all I can do is just sort of nudge a little bit and say, now remember, this is in your history. This is in your heritage. And this is an important voice to listen to again. So I'm hoping for that, and as well as hoping for folks interested in Scripture to take seriously this idea that we need to widen our horizon about who we're going to start reading and paying attention to in terms of their interest in Scripture. Because to me, that was an exciting part of this project, is that Hardie, as well as a number of others of his friends and colleagues, gosh, this stuff's just barely beginning to be mined for some of the gold that's in there. And so I'm hoping that it has a scholarly influence as well, but especially an encouragement to those who might find themselves in small groups, right? I'm aware that some of my Quaker brothers and sisters, for example, find themselves attending Sunday meeting where there's 3 other people in the meeting. And I'm aware that that can be a little disheartening. Hang in there, brothers and sisters. History is with you.
Absolutely. We're coming towards the end of the podcast, Daniel. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me, but I do have one final question for you. If you could speak to Keir Hardie now, if you were transported through a tunnel in time and you were able to speak to him, and you could only ask him one thing, what would you most like to ask Keir Hardie?
I would love to try to ask him a leading question and then just sit down and listen. And probably the most leading question I can think of is, Brother Keir, please just share with me how your faith has sustained you. What parts of Scripture have sustained you in those difficult times? Because he did face some difficult challenges, difficult times. And I think about that young man in the mines, age 10, 11, 12. I think about the time that he was blacklisted in his early 20s, his mining career over for all intents and purposes. What sustained you, Keir? I'd love to hear that. And I'm sure he would have a wonderful answer in a delightful Scottish accent. And I just really regret that we don't have any recordings of Keir Hardie. I would have just dearly loved to have heard him. But anyway, that's what I can think of.
Well, I think that's a fantastic question. Thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me, Daniel.
Absolutely my pleasure, Will. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.